Chapter 18, Hunters and Hunted. Hunters and Hunted. The first of Kythorn had dawned clear and warm, as expected for the beginnings of summer, the sun rising to bake down on that small stone town, and it was relief when evening came. The group had stayed close to the inn for the most part, everyone pairing up to take shifts, watching the gates for the patrol that was supposed to be arriving any day now. Still, it had not prevented some of them from enjoying the sunshine. Valigar and Imoen going for a walk together later in the afternoon, and Jahara herself had taken a long stroll along the river after her early shift at the gates. Athik had asked Erina if she had wanted to go similarly out with him, but she was still suffering for her excesses the previous evening, the girl spending most of the day sat with a very quiet Fritha on the veranda, allies in their solitude, the young mage seemingly grateful to her for something, though Jahara could not guess at what. Minsk and Imoen were on the last shift now, before the gates were shut for the night, the rest of their company gathering loosely in the common room for dinner. Jahara leaned back against the smooth wooden counter, taking a quiet moment stood at the bar away from the friendly clamor of their table, Brianna at the other end and trying to order a round of drinks from the overworked innkeep. Their meal was over, the remnants of it yet to be cleared, most of the group remaining at the table to begin a round of cards, a nomen, and Fritha civil conversation anything but, and providing surreptitious entertainment for the rest of them.
Did you take a walk about the town over high sun today, Fritha? No, I was on the veranda with Erina all day. Only, I noticed when she joined us for lunch, you were not with her. How very observant of you, Anomen. And you hardly touched your food this evening either. I had plenty. You had half a bowl of soup. Well, we can't all be as greedy as you. Fritha. Anomen.
A sigh next to her, Jahara starting to find Solafane standing at her side and watching them with a puzzled frown.
Their interaction is much changed from Sultanaseller.
Jahara snorted.
I am sorry to tell you that this is a return to form. They are usually like this. Well, there was a brief period towards the middle of their relationship where they seemed to call a truce of sorts, but yes, this is they. Do not worry.
She added at his deepening frown,
it rarely lasts.
A yelp snapped their attention back to the pair, Anomen vigorously rubbing his head where the spoon had bounced off it and both of them laughing. Brianna watched from the bar with an unreadable look. Solafane smiled as Fritha made her apologies, sitting back down in her chair to meekly take up her cards once more, face twisting as she clearly fought against her lingering amusement.
I am glad he is here. I think she is glad, too. Watcha!
Came the shout from the doors, Imoen bounding through with Minsk at her heels, her call like a rallying cry as all moved to rejoin the table, the group leaned in and voices low.
So, is the gate locked now?
Asked Brianna. Imoen nodded grimly.
Yep, but not before a company of 12 Tethiran soldiers marched through to head straight over to the jail. But the gates are shut,
reasoned Erina.
That means they won't be able to leave until the morrow now.
Jahara suppressed a snort, she hardly though that was the case and neither did some of the others it seemed, Valigar always to be relied upon to point out the unfortunate realities of a situation. Jahara rather liked that it took the burden of such from her.
I would not rely upon that. This was probably planned, they will wish to be in and out of the town under cover of night. Indeed, agreed Athik, the less people who see them, the less questions will be raised, especially if they are escorting prisoners. The watch will likely let members of its own army pass whatever the hour. So we're going to be trapped here?
Cried Erina. Jahara inclined her head in slightest dissent.
Perhaps not. I may have a contact who can help.
Fritha nodded, cards abandoned once more.
The rest of you, get ready to leave. I'll go over to the watch jail and keep an eye on them.
I'll come too, added Imoen, and together they left. Jahara took up her cloak.
I must go and speak with someone. I shall come, too,
said Solafane. It was not an offer. Jahara bit back a sigh, they did not have time for arguments now. Outside, Imoen and Fritha had already disappeared, the cobbled street emptying as people hurried home with the sunset. Jahara threw her cloak about her with sharp movements, her displeasure obvious enough to tempt a response, though the man next to her made no comment. She could not bear the silence a moment longer.
Surely, you can trust me in this.
But the drow shook his head.
It is not that. We none of us should walk these streets alone now. We go to the Golden Garter.
No, the druid conceded tersely,
to the Oyster and Pearl.
The sun had set and the twilight was drawing in when their group, at last, reached the gates. It had been a close thing, close enough to be attributed to Demora's grace, Jahara and Solafane arriving at the Oyster and Pearl Tavern to ask for the contact, Aleuf, only to find the swarthy barkeep in the back with the man they actually sought. Themis had greeted them with his usual cheer, the man becoming graver as they explained they were not merely there to socialize. He did indeed know of a means to leave the city after dark, though it would take some preparation, their pair made comfortable by the kindly Aleuf as Themis left to make the necessary arrangements. The harper had returned an hour later though, good to his word, and Jahara and Solafane were back at the inn as the temple bells struck 7, the rest of their company ready and assembled on the veranda. The horses were to be left there in Marmont for now, Brianna asking for another 10 days stabling for them and leaving reluctant instructions should she not have returned by then, they could be sold to cover the cost as she and Inomen had agreed. Ahead of them, the town gates were emerging from the curve of the street, 2 watchmen on guard either side of them, their mail glinting in the street lamps.
And there are Fritha and Imoen,
said Ithik, nodding to where the girls were sat upon the back of an empty cart that was parked in the alley next to the local bakery, the pair noticing them at about the same time and hopping from their perch to join them, Imoen viciously knocking the dust from her clothes as they went.
Look at me, bloody flour all over my trousers, I look like I've been manhandled by a baker.
Valigar was frowning, perhaps he was worried she had.
Any sign?
asked Inomen. Imoen nodded.
Yes, they left about a half hour ago, empty-handed. Which is one thing, at least,
sighed Fritha.
I hope they will still be heading back to this camp despite that. Imoen snuck up onto the walls and watched their lanterns travel west until we lost them. You can get us out.
Jahara nodded.
I believe so. I'm sorry,
came the first guard, the younger and shorter of the pair by quite a bit on both scores, his gnarled partner watching them with an undisguised dislike,
but you'll have to halt there, the gates are closed for the night. I have a pass here from Master Tobias of the Town Merchants Guild, we have instructions to meet his caravan tonight on the main road, ready to escort it to Dar Omar.
She handed him the parchment. The man considered it with a frown and long enough for doubts to rise, and to her shame, Jahara wondered if Themis had not betrayed them at Rahir's behest, when finally the guard drew a sigh.
Well, that's an official guild seal, but why didn't he just send you out before the gates shut? He did,
laughed Imoen,
but we had a bit of trouble rounding up the gang. You've got some nice taverns here.
Ah, let
them out, Sid,
sighed his partner.
Less of their sword in here the better.
He spat at her feet, Minsk twitched.
Dem mercs.
The guard shrugged to himself, a hand cupped to his mouth as he yelled up to the gate tower,
"Open the gates!"
The heavy wood swung back, the rush of grass-scented air sending a calm energy through her body like nothing else could, Jahara at their head as they stepped under the gates and out onto the plains. They joined the road as they told the guards they would, Valigar taking them along that stone path until he was sure their dimware lights could no longer be seen from the town, and they moved out into the plains, following the road west, the night closing in about them, when Solophane's sharp eyes spotted it, the pinprick glow of a distant campfire. And there they stopped, tents pitched and gathered by habit around an open circle where no fire could burn that night. Jahara had volunteered for the first watch with Minsk. The man sat across the circle from her before his tent, his attention on the hamster scurrying about the ground before him. Jahara smiled to herself, enjoying the tickle of the cool grass between her toes. It was good to be out in the wilds again, to feel the earth underfoot and the breeze in her hair, to feel part of something timeless. Wars and the other follies of men would come and go, but the stars and mountains, the plains and forests would endure forever. That was if she had anything to say about it. A long grateful sigh stirred the surface of the tea Frith's magic had brewed an hour ago, the chipped porcelain still holding a comforting warmth even after the liquid within had long ago cooled, the woman watching the fire burning down the plains. Opposite her, Minsk smiled.
"You are glad to be away from the town, yes?" "That I am. I understand it, too. People are not made to be all closed up behind stone and wood, though many seem to disagree. And they say Minsk is mad, eh?"
He chuckled to himself, scooping up his hamster as the creature sniffed around the tent flap behind him, perhaps tempted to join the sleeping Valigar, the man's eyes still averted as he continued quietly,
"The other night, you met with the Harpers, yes? Solophane told you?" "No, who did?" "He was worried, good Solophane was wise to join you."
Jahara scowled, but made no comment at the hamster's pronouncement, that oily stir of worry heavy in her stomach as she admitted,
"It was fine, Minsk, strained, but I was greeted as a Harper and welcomed by some."
"One," her mind corrected brutally.
"Others, though, still blame me for Derman's death. Rahir, the leader there, warned me my actions are being watched."
It sounded more like a threat when she said it out loud, but Minsk was seemingly undaunted either way.
"Let them watch, we walk the path of honor." "Do we?"
Jahara sighed, unaccustomed to such doubts.
"They do not agree. They believe this camp will help more people than it will harm. Men should not be taken and imprisoned for their blood, that is wrong, and you know this, you fought hard against that fate for young Fritha."
"Yes." The worry writhed again.
"Minsk, did you know Fritha's mother was actually a priestess of Baal?"
Jahara knew full well he did not, but the lack of subtlety to her question was lost on him. A pause as this information was processed, mind firing to body to move those broad shoulders in an unconcerned shrug.
"I see this makes no difference."
Jahara did not agree. Fritha had spent almost 5 summers at that temple before Gorion had rescued her. What had happened in that time? Had she been hurt? Used in the countless dark rites for which that fell church was famed? Did Fritha even recall her time there? Even if she did not, the unconscious scars of such ordeals would be deep and affect a person still. The question was merely how.
"At this time, my thoughts are with Imoen,"
the man opposite continued, suddenly frowning, Boo seeming to sense it as he stopped nibbling the man's bootlace.
"I am told she and Valigar have paired. I am not pleased, but all must be left to make their own paths. Minsk and Boo will be here should Imoen have need of us."
Jahara stifled a laugh to a smile.
"You speak as though she were your daughter, Minsk, you were just the same when Anomen and Fritha found each other. And Bu says we were right then, too. No good came of that in the end.
Jahara just shrugged.
Some relationships do not last, no, but it does not stand that no benefit comes from the time together. Perhaps, though I do not think a love-lasting one but turning of the moon is could have yielded much.
They shared a rather unkind laugh, slightly too loud to be considerate, but it felt good all the same.
Minsk, you are becoming quite sharp in your old age.
The Rashmi grinned, mirth twinkling in those beetle-black eyes.
Bu says, I have had a good mentor in you.
For 3 days, they tracked those soldiers, the men keeping mainly to the road for that first day before they turned sharply southwest, taking a narrow little used highway that skirted through the tamer western edge of the mere, their own group keeping to the trees as they followed them. Fritha was glad to be away from the town, just alone with her friends and nothing to tempt her burgeoning anger at the world, and she felt more herself than she had since her last visit to the mere. She had a path to walk now, and, be it right or wrong, it always felt better to be doing something. Besides, she was apparently the chosen one, and in all the stories she'd read, they didn't usually make any horrendous mistakes, at least not until right at the very end. It wasn't much of a comfort, but there you had it. The long days of walking had given her time to think on things, some would say dwell, but it was all the same in the end. Old memories were returning, brief flashes of her blessed life at the temple coupled with longer recollections of those first few years in Candle Keep, before Imoen had arrived, those years of silence and coldness, and a loneliness that had seemed without end. Solafane had been quieter, too, and though he had told her of the Harpers and his meeting with Rahir, she could not shake the feeling he was holding something back, and those last few days were spent in a companionable silence neither of them saw fit to break. Solafane had a secret, but then so did she, now, those hidden memories of a childhood all but forgotten. At least, that evening had proved a pleasant distraction, the end to another day of walking, finding them all gathered in a small clearing, far enough from the road to allow for a campfire, Fritha eating a sharp apple just on the cusp of ripeness as they waited for Valigar to return with whatever he could catch in those forests, the man sent away by Imoen with a kiss and a wave that the rest of them kindly pretended not to notice for his sake. And her friend was still full of the cheer only mutual affection could afford, Imoen on form as she entertained the group with the story of how she and Fritha had broken into the high house of Gond.
And this gnome, mad as he was, offered us 500 gold to acquire for him one of the latest exhibits, a telescope from farthest Lenton. Of course, we agreed in a shot. Young Imoen,
sighed Minsk gravely.
If we were in that city now, Minsk and Bu would be finding this gnome and showing him his error for leading our young girls astray. I don't think these two need much encouragement,
laughed Athik.
But why?
Pressed Brianna, in the same question she had presented to them since Imoen had begun the tale.
Did you need the coin that badly?
A glance between Fritha and her friend, Imoen raising her eyebrows.
The truth.
Fritha bobbed a shrug.
Why not? Well, because I wanted to show off to the boy I liked in the local thieves' guild. And I, in my rampant jealousy, wanted to do something with Imoen without him tagging along.
Jahara was laughing even as she shook her head.
By Sylvanus, I forget sometimes how young you both were.
So, anyway, the night comes and we're hidden in the gardens next to the temple awaiting our chance. There was a young acolyte who I had spied earlier in the day who I knew would be easy enough to distract. He arrives on duty and our leading lady, here, makes her debut, flying up there with a squeal of, "Oh, help, help! I've been robbed!"
brigands have.
A pause to the theatrics as Imoen turned to her friend.
What do you tell him they'd nicked again?
Fritha quickly swallowed a mouthful of apple.
My research notes into the Ulcaster ruins. That was it. So off he goes to escort Fritha to the garrison to report the crime and giving me chance to sneak in to get that telescope. A quarter hour later, and us two are tearing back to the elf song like Gond himself is after us. I still cannot believe you stole from a temple,
tut Erina.
Well, we did,
laughed Imoen proudly.
And that telescope wasn't the only thing stolen that night. Our young acolyte asked a certain damsel to meet him on the morrow.
A round of laughter and good-natured teasing. Fritha sighed, Imoen recalling to her that venture's one regret.
Poor Heleth, I never did meet with him.
Imoen was much less concerned.
Don't tell me you still feel guilty about that. Only when I think of it. Hey, what did happen to the 500 gold we were supposed to get for that jaunt?
Fritha couldn't help a laugh.
You won't like it. Try me. I donated it to the Temple of Gond. Fritha.
Athik laughed loudly.
Ah, that reminds me of that time me and Vico snuck out one night and headed the city crypts to try and find the lost tomb of Mage Sevesi the Blind. We had been hired by some relative who wanted his old signet ring, and anything in the tomb else we could have as well as 200 gold for the ring itself. Well, we found it in the end, but the tomb had already been looted by some luckier bastards than us. They didn't touch the coffin itself though, too many traps, and once Vico disarmed them all, we got our ring. Course, I just threw it in our loot bag with the other junk and think nothing of it when Erina comes by in the morning for the purse to get her breakfast. I eventually get up to find the priests had come round the inn collecting and you had donated it to the Ilmaterans round the corner. Well, you should have told me, shouldn't you?
Giggled Erina.
They gave it back once we told them. Besides, you know I don't approve of tomb robbing. Honestly, despite the fact I would not appreciate anyone disturbing my remains when I am gone, between the extra equipment and the subsequent donations to the temple for treatments for corpse rot, they usually cost more money than they make. Yeah, but think of the adventure. The treasure. The interesting new diseases,
added Imoen. Anomen was fighting against a smile.
I am glad your excursion to the Ithcatlan tombs was not so eventful, Fritha. You went tomb robbing?
Cried Imoen.
I wasn't tomb robbing, I was looking for something specific. How did you think I raised that 15,000, prostitution? And while we're on the subject, I recall a certain night being along for a couple of our more interesting jaunts. I don't rate you much as a lookout, Anomen, but I never could have robbed that apothecary without you.
Anomen was instantly scarlet.
Fritha.
Imoen was nodding slowly, looking the man up and down as though she had never seen him before.
You helped Fritha rob a man, Anomen? I'm impressed. My lady, it was not so. I merely had a conversation with him and provided a distraction for Fritha as she took his receipt book. We suspected he was supplying a necromancer across the city.
He added hastily. Fritha grinned.
Yes, and very well Anomen did, too, this great long tale about illicit activities and investigations by the Order, and you thought him beyond any falsehood,
she added to Brianna. Anomen frowned.
Well, appreciative though I am of this praise, I believe the true talent for stories rests with you, Fritha. Indeed,
agreed Solafane, fine smile gracing his fine face.
She wove tales in the Underdark to fool an illithid. You were in the Underdark?
Exclaimed Brianna.
That they were, their passage made with lies that would have pleased even the Spider Queen, had they not flouted her very plans. I would be very interested to hear the tale.
Perhaps that is a story for another time, said Jahara shortly. Fritha felt rather disappointed, perhaps the woman did not see the things done there anything to be showing off about. Brianna smiled her acceptance, turning back to Cellophane to add,
well, as undoubtedly useful as such deceptive skills are, after watching you practice this morning, I am sure I would rather have yours with the blade.
The drow just shrugged.
Perhaps, you would not if you knew what was needed to forge them. Maybe so. I was taught by the temple sisters and the militia, though I hold a fear that such informal training could have left yet untested gaps in my skills. Who says? You will find out soon enough. Me and Fritha just got taught by the guards, and even then, not much, just enough to keep us alive really. Looks like it worked well enough,
laughed Athik.
What of you, Anomen?
Asked Cellophane.
I was taught at the seminary. We were trained in arms by years, the older group's teachers to the younger ones, with the warrior priests instructing only the eldest boys, and all devoting some time to train the year below them. At the seminary, the older boys could be a bit heavy-handed during practice, until you were same size as them, of course. They were charged with instilling discipline in the younger boys, though some were overly zealous when it came to punishing breaches. That's a bit mean,
cried Erina. Anomen shrugged.
I agree, but there were a few boys in each year who held no love for Helm or his teachings and had been sent to the seminary quite against their own desires. They were usually from noble families who saw some benefit to having a son in the church, and there was much resentment in them. Poor lambs,
tutted Imoen.
Still, I might not have minded taking a couple of beatings in place of some of our punishments at the keep. What on Toriel did they have you do?
Asked Erina. The girls shared a look.
Scribing,
groaned Imoen.
Reshelving,
sighed Fritha.
Archiving,
they chorused together.
Scribing was the worst,
Imoen breathed, leaning forward to let the firelight cast eerie shadows across her face for her tale of blood-chilling horror.
Hour upon hour in that dim room, every breath a mouthful of dust and the only sound the maddening scratting of a dozen quills. I didn't really mind scribing,
said Fritha, casually sucking a spot of juice from her thumb and tossing the apple core into the bushes behind her. Imoen was appalled.
Are you off your head? It was torturous. Only because the terms were,
clarified Fritha, striking the rules off on her fingers.
You had to do a certain number of pages before you could go, and they had to be legible, and your handwriting is so appalling that you had to do it all at half speed.
Everyone laughed, Imoen more than any of them.
Still, it was quite bad. Sometimes, continued Fritha, with an absent sigh, it all depended on who was checking your work. Most days it was fine, but if you got one of the older sages in there...
She shook her head ruefully.
No hope. Half-blind as they were, they couldn't have read it even if you had printed it out in letters an inch high. Illegible, they'd croak at you, striking through the pages with dark red ink and sending you back to your desk to do it again, grumbling about how everyone was always in a rush nowadays and no one did anything properly anymore. But even then, it was still better than reshelving. I thought that was all right actually,
offered Imoen blithely.
How can you say that? It took forever.
Her friend snorted.
Only if you did it in alphabetical order, I just used to shove them in where there was space. I knew it,
cried Fritha.
I bloody knew it. Every time I was sent to that storeroom the pile in there was larger. The monks must have just gone around after your sessions and pulled them all back off for me to do. Well,
sighed Jahara as the laughter faded,
I am going to make my prayers while there is still enough light. Someone needs to stoke the fire ready for dinner. Yes,
teased Imoen, a gnomon rising as the druid did.
I will join you, my lady.
Minsk was eyeing the dwindling pile of twigs next to his tent.
Who says we will need more firewood?
Solifane nodded.
I will help.
And the others dispersed about them with mutters of prayers and chores, leaving only the four Balspan and Brianna.
Well, I'm going to get some more tea,
announced Imoen, standing to throw a few twigs onto the fire in the most cursory adherence of Jahara's orders, and refilling her cup.
Do you want some, as well, Fritha? No, sod you. You likely owe me a 10-day in those bloody archives. We ever get back to Candlekeep and you can have them,
laughed Imoen, skipping back to her seat. Perhaps she thought the chance of them returning home so slim as to make this a very safe promise. Across the fire, Arana sighed.
Candlekeep the mage who taught me used to talk about it from time to time, said he would give his beard for a few hours in the libraries. What was it like growing up there?
Quiet, said Imoen promptly. Athik laughed.
I can't imagine anywhere was quiet with you around. You cheeky sod. What do you expect from your fellow Balspan? We're family, sis.
Imoen laughed, Fritha letting her gaze travel that much reduced circle.
It's strange to think we're all related. Well, all but Brianna, that is. Are we?
Countered Arana.
Bal took many different forms to score his mortal progeny and ensure his return.
Imoen was grinning again.
We all go on about Bal's great plan for survival, him sowing his mortal oats. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he just found out he was going to die and he thought, sod it, may as well go out in style, and then spends a decade or two whoring himself up and down Faerun on an endless quest for warm ale and loose women.
Fritha was laughing, flapping her hands in her delight.
Yes, yes, and then afterwards the other gods are all, oh, Bal, you cunning swine. You've sown your essence all across Faerun in a clever bid to cheat your death. You what?
Questioned Imoen densely, doing a less than flattering impression of that dark dead god.
Oh, yeah, that's, totally what I meant to do all along. Yeah, mortal progeny and that. I do not find your mirth appropriate,
snapped Brianna over their laughter, face flushed in her displeasure.
Bal was a god, full of power which he put to great evil and no source for merriment. Says who?
Challenged Imoen.
Says anyone who understands that his evils are still worthy of fear and revulsion. Brianna,
reasoned Fritha before Imoen could tell the woman just where she could stick his evils.
To laugh at a thing removes the fear of it. But should it? I believe it right to fear such evil. Bal's crimes were countless, that he raped your mother was surely the least of his atrocities. Who told you that?
Demanded Fritha sharply. Brianna looked surprised.
Well, what lady would submit to such a thing?
Fritha said nothing, feeling slightly nauseous as the old memories and her anger surfaced as one. Brianna leaned forward, a hand held out and hovering over her own.
However she came to bear you, Fritha, I believe your mother would have loved you very much. Yes,
murmured Fritha.
I imagine she did. I'm going for a wash.
A gnomon stooped, drawing a sharp breath as he splashed the cold water across his chest and neck, skin awakened in gooseflesh as he washed away the soap with the grime of a couple of days on the move. His temples were throbbing, scalp cold and tight from where he had rinsed his hair, his feet numb and had been for a while, cold water rushing about his calves as he stood in the center of the narrow stream, trousers rolled up and shirt off. His prayers had not held him long, and the distant chatter of running water was more than enough to tempt him. He likely should not have bothered. A few more days' travel and he would not have anything clean to wear anyway, and though such did not bother him as much as it did some of the others, a certain pleasure could be found in a fresh tunic.
Oh!
An Anoman whipped around to that familiar nest of copper curls. Frithha stood on the bank, her back already to him as she hastened to explain.
Sorry, I thought you were making your prayers. I'll go. No, it is fine, Frithha, stay if you wish, I am almost finished now anyway.
A long pause where every instant he expected her to make her excuses and leave. When she dropped abruptly to sit cross-legged in the grass, her shoulders slumped as she rested her chin on her hands, back still to him.
You were hoping to have a wash yourself?
Anoman continued, mildly returning to his own. Above the stream's chatter, he heard her sigh.
No. Brianna started talking about Ball. Well, to be fair, Imoen and I started talking about him and... Frithha, is something wrong?
He questioned, finally stepping, dripping, from the icy flow to see her face, mottled pink with an angry blush he was more than familiar with lately. She would not meet his gaze.
I'm fine.
Anoman swallowed any further questions, sure he had no desire to press her on it when she was already struggling against her temper. He turned to his pack, the towel waiting there thrown over his head, and he was vigorously rubbing some life back into his frozen scalp when...
We were talking about my mother. Your mother?
Anoman repeated, his head emerged from beneath the towel, the man racking his mind for the woman's name only to realize he had never been told it.
The lady from Asha Benford.
Frithha snorted, as cold as the water from which he had just stepped.
Yes, Lady Aliena of the court at Asha Benford. How grand it sounded when Gorion told me, how different from that world of greystone silence. Imoen and I used to have such games when we were younger, sauntering around in rich old curtains and linens we had rescued from the attics, playing court games, it seems, that were as real as the truths told to me.
Anoman was frowning, the cold air on his bared torso forgotten as he tried to make sense of her scorn.
Frithha, I do not understand. This Lady Aliena.
Two dark eyes cut him dead.
My mother was not a lady, Anoman, she was a priestess of Baal. But... when Solafane and I went to the temple in the mirror, I had flashes, I saw where I had come from and I saw her. My mother, high priestess of the twin temples.
Anoman nodded, beginning now to see the root of her anger, towel discarded as he struggled into his shirt.
She was going to sacrifice you.
Frithha shrugged, the gesture not quite fluid enough to give the air of nonchalance it implied.
Eventually. Did Gorion know? No. Of course, he bloody knew. He was the one who stood there and threw the spell that ended her life.
Anoman was astounded.
You are angry with him.
Another bitter snort.
I most certainly am, but not for that.
Frithha turned from him as she spoke, Anoman moving to crouch before her as she rooted a hand through her bag to withdraw, at last, her journal.
I understand why Gorion told me my mother was just a lady of Asha Benford. The lie, as you and everyone else knows it, is a pleasant one, and the truth would have meant him telling me of my nature, something he did not want to do so early on in my life.
Journal in hand, she flipped to the back where lived the scraps of poems, old notes, and sketches she had collected over the years, Anomen unable to help a smile as his eyes caught on a blot of red, the dried flower he had given to her there still, nestled in amongst the other memories. A pause as her hand closed upon it, a well-fingered square of parchment, which she unfolded and passed to him.
This is the letter I received posthumously from Gorion that first told me of my heritage. It does not suddenly tell the truth. Fair enough, it would have been a hard thing to explain in a letter. But it does expand upon the lie.
Anomen glanced down, his eyes flying over the unfamiliar scrolling hand until he found it. Bal forced himself upon your mother. When he looked up again there were tears in her eyes, her teeth clenched into a furious snarl.
Why? Why in the hells tell someone that? If he'd wanted it to sound less than willing on her part, there are a whole host of other options. Seduced, beguiled, but that stupid, insensitive man. To suddenly learn you are the product of such a thing, it ate away at me. I had always known that she had died in childbirth, but to think that she hadn't even wanted me to start with, that I was forced upon her.
Frithha turned away again, avoiding his eyes as she dabbed at her own, her voice quiet and unsteady.
For so long it was there, this shadow over me. Others would talk of their mothers and I would get this flash, my stomach would clench as I wondered for the thousandth time how it had happened. Had she been asleep, had it been just a nightmare, the true horror of it only realized much later? Or had he come in a man's form? Had she struggled as he had forced her? I would see her there in some darkened room, beaten, crying, my poor mother. But it was a lie all that time, all that worry and revulsion, and it was just something Gorion had plucked from the ether.
Frithha whipped back to him, ablaze again.
And now I find the truth, and I prefer it. So my mother was a zealot who thought nothing of giving me up to death, at least she wanted to have me, at least she wasn't raped.
Anomen just stared back at her, no words to give that could express the hollow feeling just opened in his abdomen.
I am sorry, Frithha, I don't know what to say.
She shook her head, scrubbing a hand across her face, almost laughing.
My mother, the Lady Aliena, I'm so used to the idea by now, spent so many years imagining her life, her loves, I cannot quite believe that she is not real. It's as though I have two pasts, both as true as the other. Oh, damn him!
She cried suddenly, a fist thrown in frustration at her old leather bag.
Why did he have to die? Would he was here now so I could curse him to his face for all this? Everyone who knew Gorion goes on about him like he was some bloody saint, but was he so selfless? I was a child, barely 5 summers old, and he brought me from the only home I had ever known to Candlekeep of all places. Why? Because it was the safest place for me? How so, with all its people coming and going, and children such a conspicuous rarity? Would not some remote village have been better, with other children and a chance of a normal life? Of course, there would have been no rare books to study, no other sages with whom to pass the time. Gorion took me to Candlekeep because that was where he wished to be. The other sages certainly didn't want me there. Candlekeep was no place for a child, and how I knew it, even then. The glares and the muttered disapproval, and the constant hiss of silence whenever I dared to question or laugh or forget my place. Little girls should be seen and not heard, it was repeated so often it was like being back in the sodding temple listening to the mantras. Surely, Frithha,
Anomen reasoned, trying to inject some calm into her rising desperation,
surely, you were not so unwelcome there. After all, they allowed Imoen to stay, as well. Oh yes,
she sneered,
Winthrop found some stray and was allowed to keep her. Was it their benevolence, or the fact that after 3 years there were worries I was going mad with only 2 toys for friends?
Her distress stabbed right to his heart.
Frithha, I am sure that whatever his faults, Gorion cared for you. You want any more evidence?
She demanded, the parchment snatched from him and rattled furiously in the air between them.
Then here it is, in his own hand. Bal raped your mother. I know he likely did it to set up a revulsion of it, to ensure. The first thing I felt on discovering my heritage was not a thrill of power, but disgust at its source, but...
She trailed off, anger finally spent, and she just looked miserable as she folded the letter back along its lines and returned it between the pages of her journal.
Gorion could not have loved me, not when he could do such things. Even in his last words, he could not spare me from the lies. Do you truly believe that?
A deep sigh, the girl leaning forward, head dropped to her hands.
I don't know, I sometimes feel I don't know anything anymore. The world is changing so quickly, I am changing, remembering, and the anger. Oh gods, I just wish this whole thing would hurry up and be over, whatever the consequences.
For a moment, Anoman struggled with the desire to pull her to him. It was almost as if she seemed to want it too, sat there before him, still leant slightly over her bag as though just waiting to fall into the embrace. But perhaps it was imagined, or he hesitated too long, for after a moment she sighed again and rose.
I'm going back to the others. If you wait a moment, I will come with you.
He thought she would pretend not to hear his request, but she heaved her bag onto her shoulder and waited while he pulled on his tunic and unrolled his trousers, the pair making their way back to camp together. They stepped into circle, almost unnoticed in the furor of Valigar's returning, Jahara busying herself over the small wild pig he had caught, while Imoan fussed similar over the hunter, and Fritha instantly left his side to join the drow seated before their tent, Solafane leaning in to question her with his usually reverent concern. Anoman felt a hard-suppressed twitch in his temple, forcing a smile as Brianna passed him a cup of the Alethic had produced from his pack, the woman eyeing his damp hair.
Do you feel better for your wash?
Anoman actually felt utterly wretched, though his state of cleanliness had nothing to do with it.
Yes, thank you, my lady. Come take a seat with me then, and stop gawking at those two.
Anoman flushed, following the woman to sit before the tent she now shared with Erina, Anoman, and a thick cramped beneath the same canvas. Brianna leaned back, eyes drawn up to the star-scattered canopy.
I like the forests, the lands around Valim's court are so barren in comparison, just hills of stone and mud. Do you miss the temple?
Asked Anoman curiously.
A little. Life there was hard, but familiar, you knew your place. Do you miss?
She cut herself off, looking embarrassed.
Never mind.
Anoman smiled kindly.
You can ask the question, my lady, and yes, I miss the order, though mostly I must admit to missing my friends.
And for a moment he was back there, in some tavern with that pair, Simone laughing as Eric tried to disapprove above the smile.
But that I am parted from them now does not always mean it will be so, even if the order will not accept me back within their ranks.
Now Brianna looked curious.
What will you do, if they will not? I will return Athkatla. The Temple of Helm there is where I was first sent as a brother, and besides, my house is in the city. Ah, yes,
nodded Brianna wisely.
I recall a certain young woman praising your estate to all who would listen the other night.
Anoman snorted. Brianna could twist the truth almost as well as the young woman she so often brought up.
My estate, or rather my house, for that is all that Fritha has seen of it, is a run-down old building, with an overgrown garden and hardly a stick of furniture in the place, and is nowhere near as impressive as the theatre she herself owns.
Brianna shrugged.
Well, at least we know her regard does not stem merely from your wealth.
Anoman enjoyed a burst of unexpected laughter.
Brianna! Look at them!
He sighed, nodding over to where Imoen was curled about Valigar's arm. Little difference he could see between that couple and the pair sat next to them, Solophane's hand resting on the small of her back as Fritha brooded into her cup.
One pair courting, one pair allegedly not, and little to choose between them.
Or us too, countered the woman bluntly.
Anomen, as far as I can see it, Fritha and Solophane are friends, just as we are. Besides, I thought you had decided to offer her no more than noble camaraderie.
I have. He snapped hotly. Brianna took no offense at either tone or lie.
As you say, though I wonder if I can believe you, knowing now your talent for falsehoods,
she teased. Anomen dipped his head, the shame surfacing.
You must think very poorly of me.
The woman shrugged.
You performed a small transgression in efforts to prevent against a much greater one. I know of more than you who would see it as a worthy trade.
Anomen noted she did not mention if she were one of them.
Right,
came Jahara, straightening from the cooking pot with a smile, her short hair almost blonde in the fire's glow.
This will likely be a half hour, at least. Let us have an ode, shall we, Minsk?
The Rashami had proudly obliged them, the words meaning little to anyone bar Fritha and their singer, though the undulating melody put Solophane in mind of the dark mountains and still black seas of his home. It was a good half an hour later when the last note was left to fade in the air, more than one voice asking Fritha for a tune, Jahara exclaiming bluntly she could not see the point of carting her lute about if she wasn't going to use it. But Fritha had refused all requests, and by then the dinner had been ready, the group sharing the rest of a thick ale as they ate before, at last, retiring to their tents. Solophane slipped past the canvas flap, their bedding already laid out and Fritha curled within hers, her hair piled high upon the pillow behind her. There was a wall between them now, slight but it was there and had been ever since he had told Jahara of the mirror and one of the many secrets Fritha had discovered within. A part of him wanted to tell her of his slip, that momentary lowered guard, but he had failed her and he could not bear to have her know it, too. In the gloom, Fritha stirred, face dipped beneath her blankets and he heard her yawn.
Did I wake you? No, no, when are we on watch? The 4th hour.
Fritha sighed, shifting over slightly as he changed his clothes and settled under the blankets.
Well, at least it is convenient for your prayers.
Yes, Solophane agreed slowly,
it is good to unburden one's soul. Are you ready to speak of what upset you now? Ah, it was nothing. Brianna just reminded me of the lies that Gorion told me concerning my parentage. I stormed off, spoke to Anomen and we came back.
Solophane lay still, seeing the human's face behind his eyes and that soft, sad look he often wore when the girl's gaze was elsewhere.
He is in love with you, you know.
A groan in the darkness.
Oh, not this, Solophane, not from you. Gods, I think the only person who hasn't told me Anomen loves me recently is Anomen. That he will not speak of them, does not change his feelings,
the drow pressed quietly. Fritha slammed a fist into her pillow with a ferocity that alarmed him.
Well, I don't care. I don't want anyone to be in love with me, I just want everyone to bugger off. I see. I can share a tent with one of the others, if you would rather be alone.
Another sigh, though he could hear the warmth behind it this time.
Don't be daft, Solophane, you don't count. And why is that? You just don't. You make things easier.
A paused as she considered it.
You're like a balm for my life.
Solophane smiled, she used that foreign tongue so nicely.
I am glad. You seem happier, too, now we are away from the town.
He felt her shrug.
Just happy to be getting on with things. Every ball spawn we save makes balls return all the more distant, or so I'm content to believe. Others do not share this view. No, they don't. But Melisande, the self-proclaimed guardian of the children, seemed to think the same from the way she was trying to hide them, so perhaps we're right. I wonder if she's left Saradush yet. But what of you, Solafane?
Frithla continued, glancing to him again.
Are you glad to be away from Marmont?
Solafane shifted to gaze up into the darkness, imagining the stars that hung beyond canvas and canopy.
I suppose it was hardly a trial.
Frithla heard the unspoken doubts.
But...
And in his mind he saw it, playing bulls in the park, had hiding him only from the sun's eye, the group about him meaning onlookers dared to do little more than stare. And then later, walking the city at night with only Jahara in company, swathed in his cloak and scurrying from shadow to shadow like a Sverfneblin.
These places we visit, they are always the same. I must either hide my nature, or trust others' cowardice will keep them from engaging our company.
He turned back to her.
I will never have a home up here, will I? Not as others will. No.
He smiled gently at her downcast look.
Do not be saddened, Frithla. Perhaps I was not meant for that. I believe Illustrae wanted me here, and in her we must trust.
The girl nodded, eyes still avoiding his as she asked,
How did you pray to Illustrae in Ustnatha? Carefully,
he laughed, graver as he explained,
in what private moments I had. But still then it was hard. Those muttered prayers, sometimes a rare dance or ritual, and always with that feeling of being watched, of something larger than that whole city bearing down upon me, trying to find me in the darkness. Lolth is a jealous goddess, and will not let her children go easily. It is only my lady's favor that keeps me hidden even up here.
Frithla sighed wistfully.
Do you ever wish you were back there, Ustnatha, I mean?
Solafane wondered if she did, the yearning to her voice, though that was perhaps a question for another time. The drow shook his head.
No. There are things I miss. Being different and wholly despised is a burden I doubt I will ever shake off, and I had a certain power in Ustnatha, but I would not swap it for the freedoms of this life.
He sent her a smile in the darkness, glad to see it returned on the pale face but a yard away.
My place is here, Frithla. And after these troubles have been quelled, I will see more of this land, as you promised to show me. Yes, and I will do my best to keep it.
They were 5 days out of Marmont. Their group halted on the path, this break in the canopy allowing the fierce Tethiran sun a rare opportunity to beat down on them without the shade of the trees, the borders of the path overgrown with ferns and other bushes that also appreciated this chance of sunlight. A tributary to the river Aegis had proved too wide to ford, and they had been forced to break their cover and head back to the path. The soldiers themselves were walking ahead of them, to cross at the narrow wooden footbridge. Their company had followed the path for a short distance, and they had been about to return to the cover of the trees when Valigar had noticed what he thought could be tracks cutting through the forest to the west. He, Minsk and Jahara stooped over them now. Anomen left them to their deliberations, the girls down the path paying little more attention to them as they downed their packs to spend a leisurely moment reclined against them sunbathing. Even Brianna seemed to be enjoying the heat despite the cooler climes of her home, stood chatting mildly with Ithik and the drow, Frithla the odd girl out and wilting in the sunshine, her expensive map of colored inks rattling as she fanned her florid face. He sent her a sympathetic smile that she wanly returned, nodding down the path to her friends.
How can they be enjoying this? Do you not have your fan?
Frithla laughed.
Oh, yes, wouldn't I look a picture, stood here in my chain batting away at myself with that. Perhaps, I could get you men to carry an awning over me, better yet, a palanquin.
A no-man let his gaze travel pointedly across the similarly built figures of Valigar, Minsk, and Ithik.
I believe this is the first time our company may be in a shape to oblige you.
Frithha laughed again.
I'll stick with the map.
She turned to the others.
So, have we found some?
A roar cut her off, the forest about the exploding with bodies, sunlight flashing on armor and blades, their green cloaks thrown back as the men leapt from the undergrowth. Imoen and Aruna were scrambling to their feet, Minsk charging to intercept the three men heading for them, Valigar and Jahara already back to back as they fought. A no-man pulled down his shield, no time to set it on his arm before the man was upon him, the knight awkwardly blocking the sword sweep with the unfixed shield, the blow rattling up his tensed arm. Solophane was fighting beside Brianna, no gap to her training apparent to a no-man as she wielded that blade with a skill to match her ally. Ithik had joined Minsk before their mages, Frithha rushing to aid them as she ended her own fight with a brutal slash across the face. A thunderclap left his ringing, the spell from Imoen tearing through the air to fell three of the men, their two allies turning tail to run at the sight. A no-man parried another swing, not trusting his loose shield, his mace useless behind him as the soldier dart forward with a quick thrust. With nothing else to do, a no-man braced his shield and slammed into the man with a force that floored them both, pain shuddering through him as his plate mail hit the ground, and with a last burst of strength a no-man hefted up his mace to bring it smashing across into the soldier's face. Another explosion of magic and all fell still once more. Somewhere above him, Frithha was venting her fury.
Bashiva's horns. Is nothing simple? How many, a no-man?
Footfalls about him, the others clearly alerted by her cry, Brianna reaching him the instant Frithha did. A glance between the women, Frithha suddenly pressing back into the onlookers.
Well, tend him then.
A no-man just caught Brianna's fussing, heaving himself upright with a grimace.
It is fine, my lady, the blood is not mine. I am fine, just winded.
Above him, Frithha's attention was firmly back on the task at hand.
How many escaped? I noted 3 fled the path southward,
answered Jahara. Aruna nodded.
And 1 ran east. 4. Hell's Teeth. Right, well, check the bodies, I want them searched for any clue as to their final destination.
Brianna flashed a no-man a brief smile in the sudden activity, a hand reached down to haul him to his feet as the others dispersed about them.
Masks picks, I hate searching bodies. Why? It's certainly easier rifling through their pockets once they're dead. Frithha, you know I don't do that anymore.
A no-man paused, sheathing his mace and still trying to catch his breath, the others busy about him, searching through packs and pouches, Valigar beating through the undergrowth looking for their bags. Brianna herself had crossed to the eastern side of the path, the woman at the tree line, where a trampled fern seemed to have caught her eye. He watched as she brushed light fingers across the nearest frond, the woman frowning at the red that stained the tips. A glance to the forest next to her and she was off, turning suddenly to follow the beaten trail.
My lady, you should not go alone. Brianna.
She did not hear him, the others distracted by their own searches. A no-man deliberated an instant longer and plunged on after her. The forest was cool, the wall of trees softening the noise from path, and he felt much further from the others than he likely was as he followed that short trail, only to halt at the broad trunk of an oak tree, Brianna just a dozen or so yards before him and stood over a body, the man groaning fitfully at her feet. A no-man took another step forward, about to call her name when she fell into a crouch, the dagger slipped from her hip with a practiced speed, and the body moved no more. ARandoman felt his throat close, stunned to a momentary silence, when a shout made him start, the man darting back behind the tree next to him as Brianna whirled at the sound.
"Oi, this one's alive!"
A moment to let the woman pass, and by the time ARandoman was crashing from the trees, their captive was already up and surrounded, Frithha smiling coldly as she made a slow circuit of his knelt form.
"Well, what have we here?"
He was likely a tall man when stood, and narrow with it, his dark hair short and ruffled from the skirmish, his thin spectacles cracked and lopsided on his long aquiline nose, the faint lines at his mouth and eyes putting him near his 30th winter, tan skin paling as he gazed up at them.
"Speak, soldier." "My name is Carstill,"
he barked promptly.
"Enric Carstill, healer in the 7th Battalion of the Royal Foot Corps of Tethur." "Is that so?"
Frithha considered aloud.
"And why, pray, would the 7th Battalion be sending squads of soldiers to patrol the roads and ambush innocent travelers?" "You were plainly following us." "The captain."
He caught himself just in time, mouth a determined line.
"I will say nothing of this." "Fine then, tie him up. He's coming with us."
The facade of resilience was wavering.
I'm just their healer, a priest of."
Frithha would not let him finish.
"Look, mate, you could be their camp follower for all I care, you picked your side in this, and guess what?"
She leaned in, jaw clenched.
"It was the wrong one. Bind his hands and bring him with us, I don't want to be here when and if those 4 find reinforcements."
They walked west for the rest of the day, trying to follow the scant tracks they had found while covering their own. But the trail went cold after a few miles and, with little else to do, they continued their course, making their way deeper into the forests. Valigar and Minsk on a constant lookout for tracks, and hardly a word passed between the group as they escorted their captive, the man bound at the hands, but walking freely at their center. And, at last, as the canopy above was shot with red and the birds were dipping to their roosts, they halted. The trees were growing too close to allow for tents, and ARandoman watched as those about him set down packs and prepare the fire, Valigar distracted from his own task putting up the canvas by Imoen, the girl dancing about the clearing collecting firewood. Their captive was seated in the roots of a large sycamore out of the way, Jahara stooping to remove his bonds and pass him her flask, Enric receiving it with a grateful nod. Frithha watched the exchange with narrow, calculating eyes. No new tracks had been found, of soldiers or anyone else in that forest, and though time was hardly pressing on them, they had reached something of an impasse. The soldiers who had escaped knew of them now and had survived to warn others. Following their quarry to the camp was suddenly a much less viable, perhaps even impossible task, while the men were on guard for them. ARandoman sighed, easing out the kinks in his back as he rose from the bedding he had been laying out and took a seat upon it, the small fire already taking the chill from the air as the others moved to settle about him similarly, and all eyes seemed to flick to their so far silent guest.
"Well, according to the map,"
began Jahara, straightening the parchment folds with a snap,
"we are 4 days southwest of Marmont and about the same from Dar Omar. And goodness knows how many from our goal,"
sighed Erina. Across the fire, Valigar's dark frown moved to Frithha.
"Perhaps we should give up this path, we have another to walk and as many lives may depend upon either."
The girl remained firm.
"No, this is our path." "So what are we going to do?"
asked Imoen, slumping against Valigar's arm in her despondency, his squeeze of her hand going almost unnoticed. Frithha shrugged.
"Well, our plans are a bit put out, aren't they? Still, we could always just ask him where they are taking them." She turned to their captive, a humorless smile quirking her lips. what do you say there, Sawbones? You going to let us know where this camp is?
Enric dipped his face, more resigned than defiant.
I cannot betray my fellow soldiers.
Frith sighed, seemingly expecting no less.
Thought so. I say, we torture him until he tells us.
The man's splutter was hardly audible over the uproar about her.
Fritha. Gods, woman. By helm, Fritha,
a noman cried, joining his own voice the protests.
Do not even jest about such things. What?
Fritha cried, indignant to their outrage.
I'll do it, I've been on the receiving end enough times to have a grasp of the basics. And I'm sure Master Carstill here will let me know if I'm doing it right.
Enric had paled, his thirst not what it once had been as he silently lowered the flask to his lap. Jahara was shaking her head.
By Sylvanus, what happened to the girl I used to know? She grew up, Jahara. This is war, and decisions must be made. He clearly wasn't worried when he murdered those people and threw them in a stream to rot, hands still tied behind their backs. Fritha, if you think any of us are going to stand by while you... I will,
said Solifane calmly.
Look,
cut in a thick before Jahara could explode.
I'll be the first to admit what they did was wrong, but torture. There has to be another way,
added Aruna firmly. Fritha sighed and made to stand.
Well, we can band about ideas over dinner. Minsk, do you have the cooking pot?
And about her, the others began to stir, Jahara rooting through her pack for the dried meat they had brought from Marmont.
Do we have any of the garlic left, Imoen? No, we used the last of it yesterday. I told you not to use as much.
Fritha smiled grimly at their easy banter, gesturing to the man still seated in that throne of twisting roots and watching the surrounding activity in ashen silence.
Put him under, will you, Aruna? Right-o.
And the last thing Enric saw was that young smiling face, a hand laid gently on his shoulder, his head growing heavy as the magic suffused him.
Now, don't worry, sir, just close your eyes.
Water, water, water. The map had said there was a small stream not far from there. Fritha hoped it was a more than the trickle the last one had been. Yesterday's water had been half bark and fallen leaves. Ah, simple plans were easily thwarted, as they said. So, they had been discovered and their plans thrown into chaos. What now? Return to Marmont and begin anew? Or cut their losses and head to Amcathran? How annoying they now had a captive to deal with, too. Had she meant it when she had threatened to torture him? Fritha considered it a moment without any real need. No, of course not. If it had come to it, she doubted she'd have been able to do anything more than tie him up and wave a knife under his nose. Acting in temper was one thing, but to stand before your enemy, to listen to his screams for mercy with a cold heart. She wasn't that person yet. Fritha had just said it to scare him. And perhaps to scare the others, too? A little hint at what could eventually be needed of them? Fritha sighed and shook her head at her own wretchedness. Why did she play these games? But if Carstill would not talk, despite her threats, then Fritha could see no more options than to release him, undesirable though such a course was. Perhaps one of the girls could modify his memory somehow.
Fritha.
She recognized that tone of voice, though she pretended she did not. Fritha turning back to greet the woman who was marching through the undergrowth after her with the sort of careless grace she could have never managed.
Hello Jahara. Do not you hello Jahara me?
The woman snapped.
What was that back there? Torture? I would have hoped even the threat of such were beyond you.
Fritha sighed inwardly. She wondered if Yogeshwara had had these problems, with his temple and his whole army of fanatical devotees.
Well, I have clearly disappointed you, then. I doubt it was the first instance. Oh no, you cannot play the martyr this time. We are not in the Underdark now, this is just you, Fritha, soul and all. Not in the Underdark?
Fritha cried, bristling at the memories of her own struggles, made all the harder by their reluctance.
Well, it certainly feels like we bloody are. You lot want to save ARun, as long as it doesn't stain your precious honor, and once again I am the only one willing to get my hands dirty.
Jahara swelled.
Oh, yes. And just how low are you willing to stoop in this, Fritha? You will become as evil as those you are fighting to stop.
Fritha shrugged, the woman's willingness to believe ill of her making her all the more eager to prove the druid right.
Maybe that is what is needed to win. What is the cost of failure here, Jahara? How many will die if Bal succeeds? Or perhaps an easier question for you, how many people have the Harpers tortured over the years to save others?
The druid dipped her face, unexpectedly cooled.
I do not know.
Fritha snorted, wasting this chance for reconciliation in her anger.
Perhaps you can ask Rahir the next time you see him. The way I heard it, he and Galvari had a lot in common, especially their views on Usvalspan.
Jahara mouthed for an astonished instant, before.
I need explain nothing of this to you. You yourself suggested I renew my ties to the Harpers, and it has no bearing on now and your threats to torture an innocent. Innocent? He is a man. He is a soldier. People have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. You're here, you're a soldier, you're fair game.
Silence, Fritha swallowing to add quietly,
I am not the person you think I am, Jahara.
The woman was nodding slowly.
Yes, I am being to realize as much.
Fritha drew back, unreasonably furious as this agreement stabbed to her heart.
You don't like it, then go. Go back to the Harpers, tell them to get that box ready for me, perhaps I'll deserve it soon enough.
For a blinding instant, she thought the woman would strike her, Jahara trembling in her anger, before she drew herself up and turned on her heel, the crash of undergrowth fading in the cool air. Fritha clenched her fists, knees buckling as she dropped to the forest floor.
Oh, bastard!
Perverse, stubborn girl. Why did she have to lie? Why did she want them to hate her?
Fritha! What?
She snapped, on her feet and whirling upon the stern young woman.
Oh, Brianna, it's you, I thought, never mind. You wanted something. No, but I could hear you arguing with Jahara from where I was making my prayers.
Under normal circumstances, Fritha would have apologized, this was not then.
Well, we're done now. Feel free to get back to it.
Brianna ignored this subtle dismissal.
I would speak to you, Fritha, of your earlier threats to Karstil. Oh yes, and are you going to threaten to leave, too?
The woman snorted coolly.
Certainly not. This is war, and in such times, the hard decisions are left to those strong enough to make them. I may not agree with some of your judgments, Fritha, but that you step up to take the burden of them, that I cannot fault.
Fritha frowned. Brianna had an unfailing ability to make her feel desperately uncomfortable.
You're not how I would have imagined a warrior of Torm.
Brianna quirked a wry smile.
I suppose I am not carved from the same stone as many of my brethren, but I know what must be done and what my God would have me do.
Her dark eyes looked almost black in the gloom, alive with a light of their own as she leaned in.
Trust in yourself, Fritha, the others will come round in time. I can't share your optimism,
said Fritha bluntly. Brianna drew back with a nod.
You speak of the druid. She is a fine warrior and a good woman, but her loyalties are divided. In the West, we had a saying, a dog cannot have two masters. I don't think Jahara would appreciate that comparison.
A bark of laughter.
No, I expect not. I know of before, I know when the decision came the first time, she sided with her brothers. Jahara was misled.
Snapped Fritha fiercely,
she had proved as much to me ever since.
The rasp of plate mail as the woman raised a hand to soothe her.
I understand, and your own loyalty does you credit, but I am not the only one with concerns, Anoman himself commented on it. Fritha, I speak from experience when I say that the old bonds are the hardest to break.
Brianna shook herself, seemingly as discomfited as her audience by this solemn turn, and smiling again as she added,
but whatever happens Fritha, you must know you have my faith.
And with that, Brianna turned and walked off as serenely as she had come, Fritha just left to stare after her. Is that how people saw her now, a hard person who made the hard decisions? But that was not her. She was the one who would twist and flex and find a way around her problems, rather than forging brutally through them. But a war was there now, waiting on the horizon. Should she still have to waste time dancing about? Surely as the stakes were raised, so could be the means. Fritha shook her head, she did not believe that now any more than she had done before. Perhaps war was an excuse for other people. She wasn't other people, she was Fritha, and there she stood in that cool forest, breathing in the air, redolent with last year's leaves, trying to remember the person she was and what she did best. Enric felt his eyes snap open to that darkened forest, his cry muffled by the hand that was clamped over his mouth, the man struggling futilely at his bonds, panic leaving him wild as all talk of torture returned in a flash, when a voice hissed,
"Calm down there, man, calm down."
It was the warrior, Athik, his broad face grave in the half-light, and past him Enric could see the distant flicker of the campfire just visible through the dark trunks, the outline of figures laid about it, silhouettes against the glowing embers. He had obviously been carried from their midst and likely without their knowledge, the warrior loosing his bonds as he continued with a quiet urgency.
"Listen, man, you've got to get away. The girl's mad, they all think so, though none will say it. She thinks to fight the whole of Tether to save her siblings. And torture, she isn't the person I thought she was. I don't agree with this camp you've got, but we've got bigger evils to put an end to and time is running out. You've got to get away from here. I know you've an idea where your friends will have gone, go, get the rest of your patrol and bring them, we'll be heading east back to Marmont, towards the road. Track us. On the second night, I'll make sure to lead her away from the camp late on. You can take her before she leads us to our deaths."
Enric was nodding feverishly, heart still beating a frantic tattoo against his ribs.
"I will. Thank you for this."
The warrior nodded once, clapping his shoulder and pressing a flask into his hand with the other.
"Here, water for the journey."
He had run all that first night, the cold stiffness soon worn from his limbs, and he had not even paused when the stitch had screamed, though his side and his legs had quivered under him, the beat of his blood trembling through his skin. It had been 9 miles to their muster camp, and he had reached it with the dawn to find the captain there with Leff and Ambrine, the latter grateful to see him and have a healer tend the wounds the earlier battle had left on him. The man was all but fully healed now, he and Lef crouched together as they waited in the woods just west of Marmont, the captain, Graven just behind them. Their quarry's camp had been easy enough to find, Athik walking out into the forests an hour before to let them find him and arrange a place, and there they were. They had waited for no reinforcements, but the captain was confident 4 men would be enough to tackle one unarmed ballspawn. The tales of battle and bravery could clearly be added later. Enric watched them, 3 eager faces in the half-light. They sickened him. The crash of undergrowth drew his eyes back to the glade, the 2 figures clearing as they drew closer. She looked smaller than he had remembered, her voice high and filled with a childlike delight as she exclaimed to the tall man next to her,
"Really, a whole patch of sprites eat mushrooms? Our dinner is suddenly looking a whole lot more appetizing." "Yeah, though I need you to be sure, they look similar enough to dragon caps and I'd rather not poison our lot."
A ripple of laughter.
"No, but the difference is easy enough to spot. If they're the dragon caps they'll bruise yellow when."
The captain gave the signal and she stopped the moment they stepped from their cover, face frozen in her anger and instantly whirling on the man at her side.
"You! Take her!"
shouted the captain, and she struggled vainly as Lef and Ambrine sprang forward to grab her arms, the girl still screaming abuse at her betrayer.
"Dog! Wretch! I'll carve out your lying tongue!"
Athik just shook his head.
"I am sorry."
The girl stopped her fight just as suddenly as she had begun it, her expression one of utter contempt as she spat at his feet.
"You traitorous bastard, I'll see you dead for this."
And Athik watched as the men dragged her about and marched her off, their figures soon lost to the dark forest. A twinge of concern tightened in his stomach. He was not a man who worried often, but it was hard not to given the circumstances. He could see why the others put such faith in her, she was like a lion. Back at their camp, the mood was grim, all glancing up as he stepped into the clearing.
"It's done, they've taken her."
Jahara nodded.
"And now we just must follow them."
End of chapter.